Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Maine Department of Education's virtual professional development session today. Today, we are working with Crystal Polk, who's going to talk about book sharing for integrating social studies in middle school. Although knowing Crystal, I know that she's not going to be super specific to necessarily grades 6 through 8. I know Crystal's got a very wide range of background and knowledge. So don't feel bad if you're kind of upper elementary or maybe even a little bit of high school. I feel confident that Crystal will be able to help you in that. Crystal is a former participant in one of my teacher leader cohorts, class of 2018, I believe.
Yes.
And yep, Nina will have it recorded and posted very quickly. And if you need to contact her, just let me know. My favorite Crystal story was, I think this is really important when we're talking about like books and reading and literacy. And Crystal, I hope this is correct. I always say it's you, but I hope it's the right person. Is that you told us once we were doing the Doug Buell activity about like what type of different ways we read for pleasure reading or for work reading. And Crystal had said that she had a collection of books on her nightstand that she was looking forward to reading. And then her school gave her like some mandatory book study PD books. And some of the books were the ones that she'd wanted to read. And then she found herself all summer dreading reading them because even though they'd started in the category of pleasure reading, the very fact that it had been assigned now as like a work-related reading took away that component of it. And I've used that as this great example of when people, say, well, kids don't want to read. I always say, well, do they not want to read, or do they just not want to read what we assign them? Mm-hmm. And how much flexibility can we give kids in that piece? And I always go back to Crystal's story of a book that she was so excited to read completely changed when it was assigned. So, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Crystal to do a more formal introduction of herself as she would like. But the rest of the way, Crystal's gonna show us more about books.
Good morning, everyone. This is going to be a pretty informal book talk. I have some things prepared to share with you, and I hope that you feel comfortable at asking questions, either in the chat box or just unmute. So I think we're all learning how to manage our chat boxes. But feel free to just chime in and ask questions or make comments. So as Joe said, currently I teach grades 6 through 8 social studies and reading. We don't have an ELA class. We separate reading and writing in my school. So I found that when I started teaching 6th grade, didn't have a strong background at all with social studies. So out of necessity and feeling like I really wanted to increase their knowledge of the social studies, I started integrating into my reading classes as well. So today I'm going to share with you some of my ideas and some of my books that I use with kids that I have found to be most engaging, and hopefully you will share as well as we go along. So my objectives today are to talk a little bit about funding source ideas. I always find that people can be distracted if they're sitting, thinking, and listening and don't think it's realistic to get multiple copies of books. So I start with talking about a few of the source ideas that I have used over the years. And then I'm going to share some text titles with you, both literature and a few instructional strategies, and I'll try to incorporate those in as we go along. And then, of course, I want to engage you in conversations because I know you all have a lot of great ideas as well. So I hope that you feel comfortable sharing. So purchasing books, right off the bat, I have borrowing. So there are some great places that I would recommend borrowing books or considering. The Maine Holocaust and Human Rights Center has some multiple copy books that they will lend for free. And I borrow a lot of my books from the Girls Talk Teen Voices program in the communities near me. And those are multiple copies of books that have been engaging for especially females, and they have multiple copies that they will let me borrow. And then we team up, our ELA teachers and our social studies teachers district-wide team up also with our science teachers when we're ordering books. Gifted and talented program money. I've used the Stephen and Tabitha King Foundation or Retired Local Teacher Association grants. I bought a lot of books on eBay from retiring teachers who put their books into lots or collections of books. And I've gotten some great deals that way. Scholastic Books also has $1 and $5 sales. And if you have other funding source ideas, I'd love to have you post them in the chat box for everybody to see. This is a site that I really couldn't do without, and I have used Common Sense Media for many, many years in terms of digital online safety. But a couple of years back, I was assigned to teach a film class, kind of an extra enrichment class. And I found that I could not keep up with watching all of the films before class because each week I had to have a different movie. And I did pretty well with it, but there were some weeks that I just couldn't keep up. So I discovered that Common Sense Media has a film review section. And then I discovered that they also have a book review section, and it's very, very complete in terms of letting you know what parents might be concerned about in the book. And it's become really invaluable to me to review the books before I purchase them, to see if it's something that I would like to have my students read. But also, it's impossible for us to read every book that we hand to students. So Common Sense Media gives me a good heads up if it's not going to be a good match, or if parents are going to be concerned about a particular text. So if you haven't checked that part of Common Sense Media out in terms of their book reviews, I'd really encourage you to do that. If you're not using the main digital library, I'd really encourage you to use that. The novel list from the main digital library, I have a screenshot up there. I use that very frequently. It's got great reviews for kids. I teach all of my students how to use it. It's got this terrific feature that if you like a particular book, if they're in love with a particular title, then it will give them on the right-hand side a list of books that are similar to that. And I found that kids really love that. If they find a book they're in love with, they can find something similar, and it's really helped them with their reading. And then this other list here of links, these are the ones that I use the most when I'm looking for great new books to use. And I'm always looking for nonfiction pieces. And so these are my links that I go to when I'm looking for what's new with nonfiction that I can use. This is my favorite teacher text that I find that I use throughout the year. I mean, I have lots of teacher texts that I use, but this is my favorite, and I find that I use it year after year ever since I've learned about it in my classroom. And it really helps me teach. If you do not do a lot of teaching with primary sources, this is a great place to start. It has templates, and I also run my induction program in my district. So many times I have purchased this for my new teachers to help them get started in the classroom. I've purchased it for both ELA teachers and social studies teachers. It is excellent. So I would highly recommend that if you haven't checked it out. Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to go through some of my favorite books, and I'll talk for a bit, and then I will stop, and we can talk as a group about our favorite books. So I broke this up into topics and then the different centuries. And so when I stop talking, if you have a particular area of interest that you'd like me to give opinions about, I would be glad to do this. This is in no way a comprehensive list of what I use, but it's my favorites. knowing that we have time constraints. So with the Constitution, I stumbled on this project. Now, this is not a book specifically, but it's been incredibly powerful for my teaching. So I came across the Montana Sedition Project. It's called Hattie Big Sky, and it's a fictional piece about homesteading in Montana. And it goes along with my World War I unit because the characters, one of the characters in the book is away fighting in the war. So I wanted to find more about what was actually going on in Montana during World War I. And I found this amazing project. And this is actually a screenshot from a video that I purchased from Montana's public television. And they have a wonderful website. And I've loaned this to my colleagues at the high school. Probably the video is better for high school, although I do use parts of it with my 8th grade. But the website is really powerful for any grade, I would say. And it's about specific stories of Montana residents who were actually jailed for speaking out, and not speaking out in big ways, but just things that kids could see themselves saying. And then they trace the fallout of what happened to the family as the person was jailed. And it's an incredibly powerful story. Wonderful primary sources found at the website and woven into the documentary. So if you do anything with First Amendment rights or free speech or World War I would strongly encourage you to check out the Montana Sedition Project. And then this one is just a collection. It's Words That Built a Nation. It's a wonderful collection of primary sources that I use in my classroom. Economics, this is my favorite book, and I am using it with 8th grade now. It's called The Clock, and it's set in 1802 in New England, so the kids can really relate to and connect with the setting. But it has amazing themes. The clock is really a metaphor, and it also addresses workplace safety, child labor. It's especially powerful for young women because women can see that, girls in your class or women in your class can see that they did not have a strong voice. And it's about a father who really can't control his spending habits, and he finances a clock. And that means that his daughter has to give up her dream to be a teacher, and she's forced to go into the factories to work. It also addresses sexual harassment in the workplace and what that looked like for young people working in factories. So it has all kinds of social issues connected to it, and the kids find it really engaging. It's not a difficult book to read, but the subject matter is better for older students. You probably all heard of Lawn Boy and Lawn Boy Returns by Gary Paulsen. That's very rich with all kinds of economic terms, and the gist of it is that the boy gets a lawn tractor from his grandmother as a birthday present, and then he goes on to start a successful business with that. Kids tend to love it. It's a great one to use when you're teaching economics. And then if you haven't heard of this one, it's more of a picture style book, but it's set in Aroostook County, Maine, and it's World War II, and it's a great story. I would highly recommend it if you don't have it. Witch at Blackbird Pond, I'm not going to say a lot about. Kids. Some kids love it, some kids don't. And then the 1700s, my favorite Revolutionary War book that I use with kids is April Morning, because it does help me teach the standard where you have to compare the book and a movie, and the movie is not so bad. It's hard to find good movies that kids can watch to teach that standard. But the kids can relate to the characters in April Morning, and I find that it's pretty engaging for them. This one I use, it's a newer one. and I use parts of it for read alouds with kids. I only have one copy, and that's how I choose to use it, is to do read alouds, to teach them about Benedict Arnold. And there's some pretty good pieces about Maine in there as well. If you're doing debating with the Revolutionary War time period, George versus George is excellent. And this is more, again, of a picture style book that's filled with nonfiction information. If you are teaching about yellow fever, this is a good one. This is a fictional piece. Okay, the 1800s, I've already talked about the clock. This one is a great read aloud series. When I taught 5th grade, I used it as a text with that. And it's a trilogy. And the first 2 books, I think, are the most powerful. They're great to do with read alouds for any age. But the middle book is Frozen Summer. And this one is really great to teach about the year. And I do, Maine did not have a summer where there was a frost, a hard frost in every month of the year. And the middle book here, Frozen Summer, talks about that. It's actually set in New York, but it's really rich to talk about what happened to families during 1816 with that disaster. And you can teach them about the volcanic eruption, Mount Tambora, which is in Indonesia, and so they can learn about that and how that affected families. Okay, this is Phineas Gage. This is a nonfiction piece that is set in the 1800s. And this is one of the medical science connected books that I use with kids. Has a fairly high Lexile, but kids love it. It is filled with primary sources, and it's an amazing story about this man who actually got a tamping rod, went through his skull, and he survived. And so it's an amazing, engaging story that kids love. So I found that really awesome. And then I do kind of this medical piece around this same time period of what was going on. And tuberculosis is another big issue that was going on health-wise. And this book is set in the same exact time period. And it's about the real life piece of how they believed that people were getting sick. Some people believed that they were getting sick from tuberculosis because one of their relatives had passed away and they were coming back to haunt them. And so in New England, one of the things that became part of the hysteria was that they would actually dig up the body of the person that died first from tuberculosis, and they would remove the heart. I'm sorry, I'm being gruesome, but this is what actually was going on in New England. They would remove the heart, they would grind it up, and they would make things like tea with it, thinking that they could solve their tuberculosis problem. And we talk about how desperate people were, certainly with what's going on right now in the world. I mean, it would be incredibly timely. Kids get really sucked in by the gruesomeness of this story, really engaged by that. But they really, by the end of the story, understand how desperate people were and how ignorant people were in terms of what was actually causing disease. So for those reasons, it's a pretty engaging book for kids. And then another one about medical issues and history is Out of the Darkness. And this is a really, really nice piece about Louis Braille. And I use this with my 6th graders. And before we start, I actually take split peas and we learn about Braille, and they make Braille messages with the split peas. So they sort of get really engaged in what is Braille. And then we start to read the book. This is a pretty short book, but kids tend to like it a lot. And then just some others. To Be a Slave is a collection of primary source interviews with slaves. And when I use this, I also have the CDs. So I play the CDs with this, and I don't have to use the whole book. There are certain parts that I can use with kids. If you don't know about this book and you teach the Civil War, I would highly recommend it. It is a collection of pieces about Maine in the Civil War, a collection of articles. And where I live in Franklin County, there's a piece from F.O. Stanley about the Kingfield, which was my hometown, rebelled against the draft. And then F.O. Stanley, who had invented the dry plate photography and the Stanley steamer, he wrote about that in the Sun Journal. And then so that article is here. This is a fairly new book that I'm using actually right now with students as we're distant learning. I sent it home with them, and it's very rich with primary sources. So it's a good book for me to send them off looking at certain pages and certain primary sources. It's about Reconstruction. It's an amazing book. Highly recommend it. And then my other group in that same class is looking at Chasing Lincoln's Killer, which again is chock full of wonderful primary sources that you can have the kids explore. And then, of course, there's things like Call of the Wild, and then a companion piece, The Call of the Klondike. This is about Lewis and Clark's adventures. Christmas Carol's another one I use. And primarily I spend my 8th grade year on the 1900s. So most of these things I'm going to share with you I use with 8th grade. So we start the 8th grade year looking at Roosevelt's trip with the Smithsonian to Africa. And I use this to really reteach debating and historical context. So this is a piece about Roosevelt teaming up with the Smithsonian and going to Africa for 11 months. And there are some wonderful primary sources online that I start with that show all of the species and the numbers of animals that Roosevelt and his small team killed over those 11 months. And the total is somewhere close to 11,000 animals. So right off the bat, kids are both horrified and intrigued as to what he was doing there with the Smithsonian. And it really grabs their attention. And most of my kids have some sort of connection to hunting. So I can really teach historical context to them. This is my teacher text that I use. It's Roosevelt's own account, but there are some wonderful resources online that have pieces from this that he had published in National Geographic magazine. And so we just go exploring along with Roosevelt, and we end up doing a debate in the end whether Roosevelt was more of a conservationist or a hunter on this trip. But this topic is something that really, really engages 8th graders because they have that, most of my kids have that hunting connection. And then this is a book that I use with kids about Roosevelt's exploration in the Amazon. This is a book that I use with 6th graders actually, and I teach about South America with this one. And it's a fictional piece about a girl who goes to the Amazon, but it's a great story that engages them. So that's what, when we're learning about South America, that's what they're reading in reading class. And then when I teach World War I, we sort of start out slow with this fairly easy book by Lois Lowry, who lives here in Maine most of the time. And she went to the Shaker Village and became very intrigued with the Shaker Village. And she wrote this piece about what happened with children being orphaned during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. And I got chills the first time I read this because my own grandmother lost both of her parents and became an orphan during the Spanish flu epidemic. And then she was left at the Shaker Village to be raised. So if you do anything with Maine history, This is an amazing, wonderful, very timely book. Rascal is another book that is a memoir, and it's set in World War I. It's very engaging for kids because the main character adopts a raccoon, and there's lots of adventures, but in the background, you know that the war is going on, and you get to see culturally what was going on in the home front. And then my favorite World War I fictional piece is Private Peaceful. There's a great movie that goes along with it. Wonderful story. It's used a ton by the British, so there are many, many rich resources online to use with Private Peaceful. And my 8th graders find the story super engaging. Then this is the one that I spoke of, World War I, and it's set in Montana, so you can teach about homesteading and what that was like. And then moving into the 1920s, this is set in Vermont. It's a real easy read, but it is filled with real history about why the KKK was here in New England and what their presence was like in Vermont in 1924. Now, this is just a book that I discovered that I don't use it with kids, but for my information, kids find the story of Henry Ford trying to build some sort of city in the jungle so that he could harvest the rubber that he needed for his tires. And, you know, the remnants of that are still in the jungle. So that story is really engaging for kids. So if you teach anything about Henry Ford and the Industrial Revolution, you might want to check out this book. It's a good one. And then my Great Depression books, I use Out of the Dust, which is free verse poetry about the Dust Bowl. I use Bud Not Buddy with 6th grade to teach them about what was going on in urban areas during the Great Depression. And then I use a companion piece. I call it a companion piece, but it's set in rural America. So we get to compare how the Great Depression affected both rural and urban areas. And then moving into my World War II unit, I use Dust to Eden, which is a free verse poetry piece about what happened with the Japanese relocation camps, and it's a very, very powerful piece that kids find engaging. And then this piece, if you have not heard of Girl with the White Flag and you teach anything about World War II, I would highly recommend it. The girl in the picture, that's an actual photograph of a little girl who was 6 and 7 years old on Okinawa, and she was wandering around Okinawa, surviving in caves, and she was sent out when the Americans came to liberate the island with a piece of white cloth tied to a stick. An American photographer took her picture, and then the story is about her journey and how she ended up finding the American photographer who took that picture when she was 7 years old. It's an amazing story of survival, and the kids find it really engaging. That's a nonfiction piece. This is a fictional piece, but it talks about the Lithuanian plight, and kids also find the story really engaging. Unfortunately, the title you have to be a little careful with and front load people about. Usually there's at least one parent that calls the school because they don't understand why I'm teaching Shades of Grey, but the kids kind of laugh about it once I explain before I hand out the book. But it's a great story if you have not read this one. And this isn't a book, but if you haven't checked out Windermere Children on PBS, you really should. If you love history at all, this is an amazing story. And there's a movie, and then there's a documentary. Just an amazing piece about how the British helped children who survived concentration camps recover. And I teach National History Day and use that. And this is a story that came out of a National History Day project in Kansas, and it's the Arena Sendler story. So we use that, and kids love the fact that because they all do National History Day projects, that this, her story kind of became well known because of students' work. So there's a movie, and then there's a book. And then I'm just going to quickly click through a few of these before we talk. Alan Zillow does the pieces where it's 10 true tales, and this one's We Fought Back About the Partisans. And his pieces are nonfiction, but that's just the strategy that we use. But I give kids each a chapter, or I pair them up and they each take a chapter, and then they learn about that person. It takes more than a day, but we usually process the information over the course of a day or two. And of course, Night, Anne Frank. This one I use, I team up with our art teacher actually, and we do a piece about monuments men and the stolen art. So this is a book that I don't have them read cover to cover, but it's filled with primary sources, and we learn the story about the stolen art. This is a picture book that I highly recommend, Rose Blanche. There's a huge amount of symbolism there that you can do when you're teaching figurative language with students. Four Perfect Pebbles is a really engaging story for kids set in the Holocaust. Prisoner B3087. And then this is another Alan Zillow piece. October Sky, when we get to the Cold War. I don't have multiple copies of this, but we do watch the movie and talk about it. And then these are just some of my more modern history books that I use. I teach pages 1 through 100 in Silent Spring. I don't have them read the whole book, but it's really a wonderful piece, primary source piece, but also lots of connections to Maine, lots of connections to propaganda and speaking out and strong women. It's just, I really love my unit on Silent Spring, and I work with our science teacher on that. And then several pieces from the civil rights movement, like The Watsons Go to Birmingham, Lions of Little Rock, Hidden Figures, One Crazy Summer, Ruby Bridges, and then an Alan Zillow piece. So I'm gonna stop here and kind of open this up for us to talk. So does anybody have any questions? And what I'm hoping here is that most of you will be willing to share some of your favorite engaging books that you use with kids.
And everybody does have the ability to unmute themselves at this point or in the chat. Sonia says, I love the Seeds of America trilogy. Crystal, will I be able to get a copy of the presentation to post with the video?
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. And Sonia,
okay, so yeah, sorry. I included the link so that you guys can click on it and go see what they look like. Maybe you've read them before, but the Seeds of America trilogy, I teach 7th and 8th grade, and I had some of my boys have read them and they like them. They have a strong female character in them, but I really like them. And it follows this boy and girl, enslaved kids who work their way through to different adventures through the trilogy. And the eyewitness, we saw Lincoln Shot. You mentioned another book that I like, but this one has primary source. They interview people who were witnesses, who were in the theater that night, and it just gives such cool details of like their firsthand accounts of what happened from their perspective. And it was a really, I don't know about for kids, but if you had them reading that other one, it would just be another cool resource. And I couldn't keep up with all of the book titles that I was trying to write down. So I definitely appreciate if you can share the presentation, because there were so many awesome books, a lot that I have read and have used. I haven't successfully coordinated something with the language arts teacher. I teach social studies, but I have, because our library was kind of, it became a classroom and not a place where kids could go get books. I created a really big library in my own classroom, which is where I use the First Book Marketplace quite a bit to get some stuff. And of course, Goodwill has so many books in their young adult section that it's the first place that I go. A lot of scholastic books go there, and they're a good deal. So those are a couple of my tips.
So Joe told you the story about my nightstand, which is kind of funny. I didn't know he was going to say that, but at the tail end of my slideshow, which I will share with Joe so he can put it up, the title is Nightstand Books, and it's books that I haven't read yet, so I don't feel comfortable like promoting them, but they're on my nightstand literally, and they are ones that I have handed off to kids, checking them first on Common Sense Media, and they look like they are really good. They're newer titles.
I have the same thing going on, so I can appreciate having a stack or 5 of books that you want to go through but cannot definitely recommend. But the ones that I suggested, I have definitely read.
In the chat box, we have Roxanne says a dramatic version of Dickens' A Christmas Carol with 7th graders, and they love it. Deborah says, I've used Out of the Dust and students really like it. Alicia says, if you want to compare books to plays, Diary of Anne Frank is really good. The play is available online. Melanie says, The Breadwinner by Deborah Ellis is a great book that I use when teaching about the Middle East and Intro to 5 World Religions. She says she's a 7th grade teacher. And Crystal, you have a question from Gina. Will many of the titles you mentioned be available in the main digital library for access while we're at home?
I think that they are. I haven't checked all of them, but as I was going through this, I was using the digital library to look up some of the titles and lexiles and that sort of thing, and I found most of them there, so I hope so.
Thank you. I'll check that out. I've had trouble opening up I'm not sure how to say it. Is it EBSCO or however you pronounce that?
EBSCO, yeah.
I've had trouble opening that and accessing the books. So when you click on download or open, all I've ended up with is downloading the image of the book, not the actual content or text. So perhaps I'm doing something wrong, or maybe it's just the source the technology I'm using. I need to play with it a little bit better.
Gina, I would probably actually, I don't want to speak for the library, but I bet you if you email somebody, they'll either get you a step-by-step directions guide, or you might even be able to get somebody on the phone. They were so very thoughtful and helpful with the webinar that they did 2-3 weeks back. So I bet you they would love to help you.
Okay, thank you. Because Crystal, you have just a wealth of information. I'm so appreciative, and I love reading these books at this age level because it gives me that, reintroduction to information that I learned when I was a kid, and it keeps conversation current with young children or young adults, or just something to talk about with people while we're all home. So thank you for that.
So are you guys saying that the library has copies of these books that are accessible online?
There are places where you can download them from main digital library, and I'm not really great at answering that question, but I will look into it, and maybe it's something that I could send to Joe, and then he could put that in his newsletter.
Okay.
And Portland Public Library is offering a free library card, so access to their digital library, and so is the New York City Library. So those are ways to access their book titles. Not everything is available because of copyrights, but I've been reading a lot, and it seems that there's a lot of classics and young children's literature that's available right now.
I have a book that I really like to play around with. It's called, I teach 6th grade humanities, so I teach social studies, reading and writing, and I like the book, The Mostly True Adventures of Homer P. Fig, to teach, to work, within the Civil War unit that I teach. And the reason I like it is because it's, I know some districts in Maine do Civil War in 5th grade, some in 8th grade, etc. But the chapters are very short, and each chapter has some vocabulary in it that it focuses on. And things about the Civil War that the kids may not have thought about. Like one of the chapters is about balloon spies. One of them is about spies who were involved in just going back and forth from place to place and bringing documents, but they looked like they were traveling salesmen or something, or entertainment people. So each chapter is very short, but each chapter is very focused on one thing about the Civil War. And what I do is I use it as a read aloud, but they all have a copy. And they do a reading reflection afterward. What is it you learned about this time period from this particular book? What were some of the vocabulary? And then when we finish the book, I'll say, take 1 or 2 if they're the kinds of kids that go through things quickly, 1 or 2 of the things that you learn and research it. Just look into it a little bit more, something that you're interested in. And it's just a very fun, very light book, but it's about a boy from Maine whose brother was conscripted, and he travels to try to find his brother, and he goes through an underground railroad home. He goes through he encounters some thieves. He ends up at Gettysburg with his brother, and the 20th Maine interaction with the 15th Alabama. So it's very, very, very light. And it just, again, the chapters are very short and kind of really focused on one thing that's really easy to teach at that one time. So that's one of my favorites. Just fun.
Pauline is the author of that, Rodman Philbrick.
Yes.
So in my presentation, if you check it out when Joe puts that up, another book by Rodman Philbrick that's fairly new that kids really find engaging is called Wildfire.
Okay.
And it's a fictional piece about wildfires in Maine. What if that happened in modern times?
Yeah.
But I've been using it to teach also about the 1947 actual wildfires that were in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
So the kids have found that they love Rodman Philbrick anyway. He's awesome
Yeah.
as an author, but that's another one besides Homer Fig that's really good.
Thank you.
I did just drop the link if you need the feedback form or contact hour, that's in the chat box. And Chris, also, I just want to make sure I'm hearing correctly, and so everybody, so you're going to give a presentation. It sounds like you did not get all the way through the presentation due to time, but you're going to share out that big piece.
Yes.
Is there anything you want to highlight, even if you don't necessarily go through the presentation, just so people have an understanding of what else is in there?
It's the more modern, like social issues, like the wildfire pieces in there. There's another really great book that I recommend that's called The Red Kayak, and that teaches moral dilemma, and it's sort of a mystery piece set in the Chesapeake Bay area that kids really love. And then at the tail end, my nightstand books are there listed.
That's a whole other presentation.
Right, exactly.
Well, it was very, I guess, timely then that I brought up that story, but it really has sat with me for that. I mean, that had to be 2 years ago, right? That was in like two and a half years ago. That sat with me, that idea of, you were very clear about you were excited about these books when you got to pick them, and as soon as they were assigned. And I think that that's such a powerful piece for educators to think about and remember.
Now, I guess I have a question about that. Like, I mean, I assign a set of books. So I have like 3 or 4 choices for each reading level. And I say, okay, you guys pick from this table, you guys pick from that table, etc. Is that enough of a choice?
I find that it usually is.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that strategy where I pull, different pieces from that time period, and they get to choose which one they want to tackle. Yeah.
And I think it's kind of a unique, situation a little bit in that, Crystal had some books of choice that then, were assigned out, right? She wasn't, it was different than here, pick some of these books, because the activity that we do very briefly is we think about, you have to do like a reader's inventory. You think about who you are as a reader and all these different type of stuff. And like one of the questions are like, what do you read because of who you are? So it was like, a parenting magazine because you're a parent. Like the MEA news flyer because you're an MEA teacher, right? Like there are things that are niche because of who you are. And then the next category was, what are things you read because they're fun, they're enjoyable, that's what you want, right? And then we had this. And then the last category was, what do you read because of work or because you're required to type stuff? You're not required to read a parenting magazine as a parent, but they're usually read by parents. So we made this progression, and then that's when Crystal said, well, very funny because I had, this type of stuff. So it was just like those different ways that we approach reading in life, how it dictates who we are and what we read and that type of stuff. And so it was just that little weird snapshot of, where I keep coming back to, kids will read. It just might not be exactly what we choose for them to read or want them to read, right? I think kids read Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and stuff all the time, and we might not find the educational value, but there's still a ton of reading that's involved with that. So is there any other questions before I end the recording? Any other questions for Crystal?